Okay, this presidential election of 1800 is way different than any election we have, and it's going to be controversial as well. So we'll start over and give you the right information. As I mentioned last week, and you can write this down, the Federalists chose President Adams to run for a second term, and they changed vice presidential candidates to Charles C. Pinckney for vice president. So for the Federalists in the election of 1800, you're going to have President Adams running for a second term, and then you're going to have Charles C. Pinckney running as vice president on the Federalist Party. The Republicans chose the same candidates they had in 1796. Thomas Jefferson would be their candidate for president, and Aaron Burr would be the candidate for vice president. What they didn't change was the way you were elected. The top vote getter would be president, and the second vote getter would be vice president. Well, when they counted the ballots in this election, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both received the most votes, 73. So we have a tie now. We have a tie. Okay? So we don't know who the president and vice president is going to be because we have a tie. Both the top two vote getters, Jefferson and Burr, end up with 73 votes. Well, there's a clause in the Constitution that states if an election is not settled by virtue of vote, then it goes to the House of Representatives, and they decide the presidency. That's the same today. Now, you have to have a certain number of electoral votes, 2/3 majority, to be elected president, right? You have to have that many votes. What happens, and it hasn't happened forever, but what happens if we have an election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and neither one of those candidates get the number of electoral votes that gives them the majority? Okay, now remember, Hillary Clinton had 2 million more popular votes than Trump did. But the Electoral College is what counts. But is it possible that after the electoral votes were counted, somebody might not get 2/3? Very possible. Usually it happens. Even today, if someone does not get 2/3 majority of the popular vote, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they get a vote who's going to be the president. Okay, that hasn't happened for years. Well, wait, what's that? Well, probably it wouldn't because they don't have it. They have an uneven number. Okay, so anyway, during this election, because both men received the 73 electoral votes, it's now going to go to the House of Representatives. Remember, in Congress you have the Senate and you have the House. This goes to the House of Representatives, and remember, the Senate has less members, right? Because it's 2 per state, and the House population is based on House population is based on state population. So you have a bigger group that's going to be voting for the break the tie than you would if the Senate did it, which is probably good. So members of the House of Representatives are going to vote to elect which man would be president and which man would be vice president. Now, what party are these two guys from? What do you suppose the majority of Congress is? Federalists. Okay? So if you had a tie between a Federalist and a Republican, it's pretty clear what the House would do, right? But they don't. They have 2 Republicans, and they're all Federalists, so they don't especially like either one, right? Well, most of the Federalists, and you need to know this, most of the Federalists at the time favored Aaron Burr. But you've never heard of President Aaron Burr, have you? So obviously something went awry, right? But most of the Federalists that were in the House of Representatives favored Aaron Burr. But there was one really important Federalist that didn't really like him and thought Thomas Jefferson would be better. Who was that? One influential Federalist. He wasn't in the House, but he had pull within the party. Very good, Brady. Alexander Hamilton didn't really like Aaron Burr. And he didn't really like Thomas Jefferson, but he liked Jefferson better than he liked Burr. Sometimes when that happens, you make a statement that you're going to pick the lesser of two evils, okay? So although Alexander Hamilton really didn't like Thomas Jefferson very much, he liked Aaron Burr even less, okay? So what he did is he went to campaigning. Alexander Hamilton, he went to these members of the House, these Federalists in the House. Were they all Federalists? No, but a majority were. And you know all the Republican ones, you know, they got to make a decision too because they got to pick between two Republicans. But the majority of the Federalists were going to make this decision. So Alexander Hamilton goes to these Federalists and he campaigns saying, let's pick Jefferson. He'll be the lesser of two evils. The Federalist Party will be better off if Thomas Jefferson is president than Aaron Burr. Well, he goes through his campaign and he talks and talks and talks. And there were 16 votes from the House of Representatives. 16. And when it cleared, Jefferson received 10 of those votes. Aaron Burr received 4. And 2 of the representatives didn't vote. They went uncast.
Can you say that again?
Yep. Thomas Jefferson received 10 votes from the House of Representatives. Aaron Burr received 4. And 2 of the members of the House that were allowed to vote didn't vote at all. So with that vote by the House of Representatives, Thomas Jefferson becomes the nation's 3rd president, and Aaron Burr becomes vice president. So again, at the time of the tie, the House of Representatives were dominated by Federalists who saw neither candidate as the answer. Most Federalists in the House did favor Aaron Burr, but Alexander Hamilton, who had a tremendous influence on the Federalist Party, thought Jefferson would be the lesser of two evils. He didn't like Jefferson, but he liked Burr even less. So he convinced the Federalist in his politicking, and when the votes cleared, Jefferson gets the most votes, he will be president, and Aaron Burr will be vice president. The good thing for the Republicans is they're both Republicans, okay? Now, we've had kind of bad luck in the last 2 elections, right? The election of 1796, we got a Federalist president and a Republican vice president, which wasn't too good. And the election of 1800, we got another mess. 1800, we got another mess. So because of these messes, Congress passed, very importantly, the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is on your ID sheet. 12th Amendment of the United States Constitution is on your ID sheet. And they did this to clean up this mess that they not only had in the election of 1800, but the one they also had in the election of 1796. So to clean up this mess on elections, Congress passed, shortly after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Does anybody want to guess what that did to solve their problem? No, just the opposite of that. It meant that you have the same vote. So you either vote for Willow and Ray, or you vote for William and Nayeli. In other words, you run together. So you vote on the same ballot for president and vice president. In other words, if you vote for you for president, you're going to get him. If you vote for you for president, you're going to get her. There's no switching around. Yep.
So how about for her for president?
You could. No, that's good. You couldn't, though. William has a good question. Well, what if I voted for Nayeli instead? You couldn't. By virtue of the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, somebody said, I'm running for president. Somebody said, I'm running for president, vice president on the Federalist side. Somebody said, I'm running for president. I'm running for vice president on the Republican side. So when you voted, you either voted here or there. And you voted specifically for you for president and you for vice president. You voted on separate tickets. So, 12th Amendment of the Constitution stated that voters must vote on separate ballots for the combination of president and vice president of the United States. Does that make sense? No longer are we going to have this problem. It's not going to be the top vote getter and the second top vote getter. You're going to vote for one party or the other. And if you vote for that party, the people representing that party will be your president and vice president. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is final actions by President Adams. Final actions by President Adams. And we'll kind of explain something to you. Ollie, do you know when we elect, next time we have a presidential election, you know what month that's gonna be? What month do we do that? Anybody know that? November, right? And as soon as the new president, as soon as Trump was elected in November, when we, the last election, then he took over office the next day and Barack Obama was gone, right?
What would you say is the subtopic of the final action?
Of President Adams, by President Adams. Now I want you to listen to this. So, when Donald Trump was elected president on election day in November, right, in 2018, well, whatever, 16, yeah. In 16, the next day he moved into the White House, and Barack Obama moved out. True or false? False. What happens? You have a period which they call lame duck period, in which President Obama served through Trump's inauguration. And when does that happen usually? What month? January. End of January. Very good. So you have a president who knows they're not returning, who's still running the country from election day until the next president is inaugurated in. That period of time, usually November, December, and most of January, that 3 months, is normally referred to as the lame duck period of a presidency, okay? And most presidents do what the last 3 months?
Slack.
Very good, mostly. I'll give you an example. When I was the principal here, way back when you kids were in elementary school, I decided I didn't want to be the principal anymore, and so they hired Mr. Smith, who was my vice principal, to be the principal. And I found that out just before Christmas vacation. So from January, February, March, April, and May, for 5 months, I knew I wasn't coming back. He knew I wasn't coming back. The whole community knew I wasn't coming back, that I was going to go into the counseling. Okay? So, did I slack off? Kind of. Okay? Because I didn't want to pass any new rules or anything, or push for anything that Mr. Smith didn't want to live with. You see what I'm saying? And he and I were good friends, so I certainly wasn't going to, put something in there he didn't like. So he and I conversed daily about his future and his vision for the school, maybe compared to mine. Some of our visions were very similar. Other visions he had things he liked. For example, he really was into the Unstoppable program. If you guys remember that, I don't remember if you were here yet or not.
Yes.
But he was really into that. That was something I could have, whatever. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean it was bad. It wasn't my thing. So he had some ideas that he was going to put in too, and then we had some ideas that he wanted to keep that I had. But my point is, a good lame ducker would be someone that would assist the next guy or gal into making the transition smooth, so when that person takes over, he doesn't have anything to live with that he doesn't like. Well, these final actions by President Adams isn't what he did. In other words, he did some things that probably were going to make Thomas Jefferson a little uncomfortable by the time he took over. And that period of time from election day to inauguration is called a lame duck period, and most do nothing or slack off. Others work with the next person coming in, and others work against the next person coming in. I'll let you decide after the lecture what you think Adams did. So when I talk about final actions by President Adams, these are the things he did from the time that Jefferson was officially elected president until he left office with Jefferson's inauguration. Okay. During this, in this case, back in those days, there were approximately 4 months between election day and the inauguration of Jefferson. So this is what Adams did in a 4-month period. During this, what we call lame duck period, he did 2 things of notice, 2 things that were noticed. You can decide whether they're good or bad. First thing he did is he appointed a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this point? John Jay? Somebody say who said that? John Jay. Okay, so John Jay's going off. Now, is President Trump right now trying to confirm a new Supreme Court justice?
Yeah.
And he's getting all kinds of trouble from who?
Democrats.
The Democrats, right? They're making it kind of difficult for him. Well, this is a Chief Justice. That's even a bigger deal. when you're replacing the Chief Justice, the head of the Supreme Court, okay? Well, he changes, he appoints a new one. And the man that he appoints to replace John Jay is a guy by the name of John Marshall. And he turns out to be very effective, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, President Adams, on his own, as one of the last things he does during this lame duck period, is he appoints a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a fellow by the name of John Marshall, to replace John Jay. What do you think the guy's political affiliation was there, Zaid? What? He was a Federalist, you bet he was. You bet he was. And that's the trouble President Trump's having right now, is what do you think the affiliation of this new Supreme Court Justice that he nominated? He's a Republican and all the Democrats are going crazy, right? That's what happens every time. It's sometimes very difficult, unless the President has a really good relationship with Congress, do they ever not have troubles getting a new Supreme Court Justice appointed. It's always a hassle, okay? Now, this was a good choice despite the opposition by the Republicans. Marshall served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. 34 years, from 1801 to 1835. He served on the Supreme Court for 34 years. And historians would tell you they were good years. He made decisions on over 500 cases during the time that he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Very well respected, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court we've ever had.
Did you say 34 or 35?
He was there 34 years,
Yeah.
and he was involved in more than 500 Supreme Court decisions. That's a lot, because it takes a little bit, doesn't it, to get somebody to the Supreme Court? And they don't just take every case. It has to go through a local, then a district, then a regional, then a federal, then it has to get all the way up to the last course ever would be the Supreme Court. So to be involved in 500 Supreme Court decisions is pretty amazing. Okay? So he was actually a good choice, but he did, Adams did what he did. Now, that wasn't the big thing. The Republicans weren't thrilled, but they weren't really mad about it, whatever. And it turned out to be pretty good, right? The second thing that Adams did maybe wasn't so good. He convinced Congress, who by the way is controlled by which party? Federalist. He convinced Congress to pass a new law called the Judiciary Act of 1801. Now, we had an original Judiciary Act back there, didn't we, when we started as a nation? And it created a court system and, so many, one Supreme Court, so many district courts, etc. Right? It established our court system. That was the Judiciary Act of 1789. This is the Judiciary Act of 1801. And what it did, and remember it was passed by a Federalist-controlled Congress when a Republican president's coming into office, right? What it did is it increased the number of judges in the federal court system by an additional 16. Okay? The Judiciary Act of 1801 increased the number of federal court judges by 16. They're going to pick 16 more judges at the federal court level. Not the Supreme Court level, but the level right below that. Okay? 16 new ones. What?
Can you say that?
Yeah. Yeah. The Federalist-controlled Congress passed a law called the Judiciary Act of 1801, and this law increased the number of judges in the federal court system by an additional 16. So you have your Supreme Court up here, and right below that you have the federal court, and they're going to pick 16 new people. Okay, 16. What's the question? It's okay, 16. They're going to add 16 judges to the federal court. Who appoints those judges? President of the United States. What party is the President of the United States? Federalist. What do you think these 16 judges are going to be? You're dang right they are. They're going to be Federalists. And who's going to inherit this Federalist Supreme Court and federal court? A Republican president. And Jefferson's got to be going, oh my God. But does the president have the right to do that? They do. Okay? So, all of the 16 new justices are going to be appointed by the President of the United States, John Adams. And President Adams was a member of the Federalist Party, and he appointed all Federalists into those 16 positions.
Could the new president work to get rid of
Well, that's a good question. We're going to get into that. That's a very good question. Now, some of these appointments, some of these 16 judges were picked like just minutes before midnight on the last day he was in office, before Jefferson was inaugurated. Because what really happens is technically we kind of go presidentless from midnight of inauguration day, because from midnight to when they inaugurate the president, technically we don't have any president. You see what I'm saying? Okay? Although nobody worries about that too much. Now, since most of these appointments of these 16 judges occurred just before midnight on the last day President Adams was in office, these appointments are known in American history as the midnight appointments. Okay? So, the two things that lame duck President Adams did, one wasn't so bad. He appointed new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, who eventually served for 34 years and ruled on over 500 cases, was considered maybe the greatest Chief Justice we've ever had. The other one wasn't so good. They being Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which increased the number of federal judges by 16 more, with the President of the United States having full authority to pick whomever he wants. And since he's a Federalist, he picked 16 new judges, all Federalists, to work with a Republican president. Many of these appointments he thought on until just before midnight, his last day in office, and as a result, those appointments go down in American history